So let me tell you how this catastrophic failure cost me the podium on this stage. All right, so let me tell you what actually happened yesterday. You saw from the intro, my chain snapped. I was getting ready to launch my sprint, and next thing I know, power comes out from underneath me. My ankle lands on the floor sideways, and I am done. My race is done. Completely failed at the last second. The last few seconds, I thought I was in a great position to launch my sprint. I was about 10 to 12 people back, and I knew there was only a couple seconds in between the group that I was in and the lead group, which only had a couple people. And I knew that with my sprint, I could bridge that gap without a problem. So I was for sure excited about getting podium finally on the third try of this race, being able to actually succeed and go for a win. But as it happens to be, this time, third times was not a charm. So the way this all started off was I ended up getting a new cassette a couple weeks ago, maybe a little bit more than a couple weeks ago, switching from a 25 to 11 up to a 32 to 11 for my rear cassette. And the reason why I did that is because a lot of the stages that I've done recently have been a lot of climbing stages, really hard. Even on my 3925, I was still only spinning gears at 60 RPM, 55 RPM, and barely holding 300 watts, sometimes barely holding 200 watts, depending on the climb. And so I knew that if I wanted to get better at climbing, I was going to have to get a little bit bigger cassette. And so I got a 3211. And so far, as I've been using it, it's been great. I've been able to not only put out a little bit more power on climbs, but also spin a little bit faster on climbs. So instead of climbing at 50, 60 RPM, now I'm climbing at 70, 80 RPM, sometimes even into the 90s, and holding anywhere from 300 to 400 watts. And I thought that was doing great. The one thing I didn't realize is that my derailleur was not meant for a cassette that large. So I couldn't use my 39 tooth chain ring, because when I switch to the 39 tooth, what ends up happening is the derailleur ends up kind of collapsing inward and the chain starts to rub. And so with that in mind, I've only been using my 53 tooth chain ring on all the races that I've done in the last week and a half or so. So I wanted to get a new derailleur, and I ended up ordering one, got it here. Unfortunately, it wasn't the right size. And what I mean by that is, while it could fit a 30 tooth cog on the cassette, it's actually an 11 speed, not a 10 speed. And again, this is, the two things that I feel like caused this failure was my lack of reading. And not that I can't read, but I just didn't take the time to read, and my impatience. And so with that said, this is how this all came together. I end up installing the cassette, or installing the derailleur, putting the chain back on, ended up having to take the chain off a second time, because when I put it in the first time, I ended up going on the outside of the derailleur cage and one of the bends. So I needed to essentially undo that, put it back in the proper way. Ended up breaking my favorite stool, which is a 3-point stool that I've had for years. And the leather ended up falling apart. And so yesterday was what felt like a disaster. I ended up taking a lot longer than I thought I would to get the derailleur installed. Had a hard time indexing it, couldn't figure out what was going on. That's when I went to the manufacturer's website to look at the derailleur again. And lo and behold, it's an 11 tooth. It's meant for an 11 speed, not a 10 speed. And so in order to just kind of finish the maintenance, to be able to race that evening, I ended up just putting everything back together, indexing as best as I could, essentially leaving it to where the bottom 5 or 6 gears were functional, pretty well indexed, a little bit, not perfect, but, pretty well indexed. And that was that. So fast forward, getting ready for the race, doing my warm up, feel good. Everything's working great. Shifting is not perfect. I got a couple gears in there that the shifting, kept kind of bouncing on and off. The chain was kind of like, chain would get on and then go off, on, off. And so I knew that there was going to be an issue there, but knowing this race is the third time I've done the fan flat, and I knew that if the group stayed together the way it has in the past, wouldn't be a problem. I wouldn't be shifting a lot, maybe a gear here and there, but it wasn't to the gear that was having the issue. So I knew that if I could stay with the group and then get to the end sprint, I could shift all the way down into my 11 tooth and floor it. And that's what happened.
So as we start approaching this bend, I noticed that the rider, Leduc, is pushing through the pack, and all of a sudden he gets on the power and starts making a break for it. And boy, oh boy, did that ignite a flurry of action. And he in the message ends up typing go. And I wasn't sure if that was a nod to others to try and make the break. But as you can see, a handful of riders end up going up the road. So I put down some power and start to push ahead, because I know that if this break is going to succeed, then I need to be part of it, because I don't want to miss out. And so as I start to ramp up, I'm, right now in the 200s, but I see that it's getting a little bit, I'm starting to fall behind, and I know that I need to push up to the front. And as the split starts to happen, I jump into the mid 300s and start to move forward little by little. And now I get on the pedals and just go for it, because I see the split is officially there. And I don't want to miss out. Now this group has come together. Thankfully, the riders behind me end up catching up. So we basically end up, the group ends up back together. Thankfully, that attack didn't last for very long, because that meant that, I still had a chance.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
And so here we go again. We're coming around this roundabout, ready to make the right turn. This rider from the dyno team comes up, starts to pull forward, and all of a sudden here comes Leduc on the power, just sprinting through the entire peloton and making his way up front. But this time there's no reaction. He just goes off on his own. And while I feel like everybody was kind of looking around at each other to see who's going to make the catch, we end up just letting him stay out front. He's got about a 5-second lead right now, but ultimately we end up making the catch. So now this is the third attack that happens, and as the last couple times I've raced this stage, people will push through that, sprint banner and start to kind of stretch the peloton out. And ultimately, we end up having to put some power down just to kind of keep up. But as you can see, right now I'm in the 400s. I'm trying to move my way forward because I see the gap is starting to grow. There's starting to, there's a break starting to form in the middle there. And the riders are just all strung out. Knowing that this is the last lap, I knew that I had to be part of this front group. So I keep on the pedal just so that way I can get up to the front. I start to coast a little bit here because I know that I've got enough momentum to get me to the front, and I knew people would ultimately pass me to help kind of bridge that gap, which will then, allow me to draft up to this front group. And as I get onto this front group, I knew that, it was still stretched out enough to where I was still a little bit uneasy about it. I didn't want to miss out, so I kept on the power a little bit as we go up that 1% grade. Kept on the power a little bit just to make sure that I'm in that group. I saw Leduc kind of fall behind, and at the time I was thinking like, great, he's finally he's finally gassed out, he's out of power and starting to drop. But ultimately that wasn't going to be the case, because this group, the front starts to ease off a lot, which then allows everybody else to catch up.
And so as we get to the final sprint, we start coming up to the corner, I knew that I was going to need to be somewhere in the middle of the pack or closer to the front in order to close down any sort of distance. The last couple times I've raced this, there's a few people that have gone off the front. The first race I did, unfortunately, I didn't get it recorded, but the first race I did, someone went off the front and basically just, they were gone. They were 10, 12 seconds ahead of us. None of us were going to catch them at any point. The second race I did, I ended up starting my sprint at the not only the very back of the group, but ended up a couple seconds behind because I was trying to get to a low enough RPM so that way I can launch my sprint. And what ended up happening is that created a gap between me and the main peloton. And then as that happened, I not only needed to close that gap, but then I also needed to push past everybody. And that ended up working well. I got 12th place on that stage, and I felt good. I felt good because I knew that, A, I could get to the end of this race with the front group, but also I knew I could compete for the sprint. So as we got to this third round, I feel like everything's going great. I feel like I'm putting out some effort. I'm hurting in terms of my legs are sore. I feel like I'm giving it all I've got. As I get to the final sprint, as we start to approach that corner, I see people are starting to push off the front. As they push off the front, I'm starting to put a little bit more effort just to kind of stay close. I want to stay within touch, but I also don't want to go off the front. I don't want to prompt any attacks at the last second because I knew I wasn't going to be able to counteract those attacks because of the fact that I wasn't in the gear that I needed to be in for my sprint. And so as we start approaching that corner, I knew that I needed to not only launch my power up, which at that time I had a draft van. So I knew I needed to launch my power up as well as once I round the corner, get into the right gear in order to launch my sprint. So as we're approaching the corner, I end up shifting down into my lowest gear, into my 5311, launch my power up, get on the pedals, and a couple pedal strokes into it, all I hear is just a snap, and my leg ends up hitting the floor. My foot literally came down sideways, ankle on the floor. Thankfully, my ankles are pretty pretty rubbery. I don't think I've ever actually injured my ankle. Whenever I've twisted my ankles, they can pretty well touch the floor. And so I took a second to collect myself because I didn't know what just happened. I eventually saw that my chain broke. I was trying to make sure that my ankle wasn't broken, so I was sitting on the bike rotating it, as everybody else just kind of flew past me. And at first I was gonna just quit because I didn't want to complete the stage the way it did, but I was just coasting, so I basically left it at that. I knew I could just kind of let my avatar coast to the finish, which surprisingly it coasted the entire distance to the finish. And as that happened, I left it as it was because there was nothing else I could do. While I knew that I could contend for the podium on that stage, I was in a great spot. I had not only had the power, but I also had the right distance between me and the front group to be able to close down that gap and also compete for the podium. But as it happens to be, ended up missing out. So that's what happened. Appreciate you guys. Appreciate your comments in the companion app, in the comment section. It really does help me understand not only what you guys are looking for and what you're encouraged by, but also what I can do better. So I will catch you guys on the next race.
This is Miguel from that thing you just watched. If you know where that reference is from, please leave it down in the comments below. One of my favorite channels to review content. So I'll leave it at that. But if you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button, watch videos, playlists, whichever pop up. But thank you so much for joining me on this journey, and I hope to see you next time.